Right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on the how to reinvent yourself and find a job you love. Obviously, a very topical subject in light of sort of news stories breaking this morning about, lots of people already losing their jobs and others threatened with redundancy. Anyway, I'm pleased to be joined with by our associate career coach, Simon North. Before we both introduce ourselves, a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, for those of you who are already familiar with these Q&A sessions, you'll know that we'll be recording it so that we can then load it up onto the Cheeky Little Careers website, just to offer you an anonymity. I won't say the word, to allow you to remain anonymous. I've got the screen set to speak of you so that the only people that everyone will see will be myself and Simon. If you do want to ask questions, we've got a slightly smaller group this afternoon. Feel free to send me those through the chat function, and we can keep this session as interactive as possible, because I'm sure some of you will have lots of questions. The format of this session will be that I will really be handing over to Simon to share his experiences of working with individuals who have gone through a career transition, whether that's out of choice or something that's been forced on them. I also work in this area, but interestingly, I've had a personal experience of changing careers twice, actually, and people do often refer to me as the Queen of Reinvention. For those of you who are familiar with my profile, you'll know that I started off life as a lawyer, and then as I approached about 3 years after qualification, I decided to make the switch and moved into journalism, which was a career that I wanted to pursue in the first instance, but like so many people, ended up pursuing something that was considered more professional, more stable, so on and so forth. So I felt very much that I was that square peg in the round hole. I found the transition quite easy, probably because I knew what I wanted to do, and I think that's one of the reasons why people get stuck, that lack of ideas, which I'm sure Simon will explore in a moment. And then if one career change wasn't enough, I in fact then switched again, this time from journalism to recruitment, but that one really was by accident. It wasn't something that I was pursuing actively at all, and it just goes to show that sometimes career changes can happen in the most unexpected circumstances. I'll share some of my experiences as we go along, but let me now quickly hand over to Simon. Do you want to introduce yourself first, Simon?
Sure. Thank you, and hello everybody. I have had a long and varied business career, and the thing that marks me out, I suppose, is that I have always focused on the people dimension in organizations. Why? Not because I'm a big touchy-feely sort of person. It's not that. It's really that I'm incredibly interested in the pursuit of the individual's endeavor through their life to do things that they really enjoy and that they're good at, and the two things are correlated. I'm sure we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. I am actually an HR professional. That's where I started, sort of by accident, a long time ago. But I went off and did all sorts of other things and ended up as a CEO. And then in my more independent career, I've been an advisor, consultant, coach, and so on, including co-creating and running a careers business where we did a lot of careers advice for people around the world and also published a lot. So that's, if you like, my credentials for being with Husnara and this business.
So yeah, so between us, we've had quite a few careers, haven't we?
Yes.
And sometimes by accident, sometimes it was meticulously planned. And that's where I want to start, really, the importance of doing some diagnostics work and planning, because I have conversations with lawyers mostly, as you know, because of the work I do on a sort of day-to-day basis, who feel really lost, frustrated. And what they'll do is, rather than actually work out in the first instance what's causing them to feel like that, they'll launch straight into the job search part of the process before they've done any sort of digging into what it is that they're after, what are their motivations, what are their values. And the analogy I use is, and I've been guilty of this myself when we were looking for somewhere to live, is browsing the, websites like Rightmove, etc., and spending hours and hours salivating over properties that were, way beyond my budget, and, trying to really sort of dream the idea of living in these huge houses without actually working out how I'm going to get there and if it's realistic. So it's that combination of, okay, do I actually have the budget to do this? Have I got a mortgage in principle? And is this realistic? And I think, frankly, the same can apply when looking at careers. What do you think, Simon?
I do. I think the whole idea of careers does get a bit dreamy in the way that you're suggesting. And I'm also picking up on your lead there, that the natural response for us when we are looking for work, whether it's forced or not, is to go and polish up our CV and then start propelling that around the market. As somebody who's worked in this field for 40 years and very closely with it for the last 10 or 15, that is the last advice I would give anybody. We were just saying before we started this session that to hear individuals who were spending their time every day because they needed a job, just applying online and sending their CVs to different places, it feels to me like you're slinging mud at a wall and just hoping that it will stick. And I think there are different ways of going about it, and we're going to talk about that over the next few minutes. But I completely concur with your view that doing the diagnostic work up front is the place to start. Yeah.
And how would you approach that diagnostics work?
Well, I think there's just something very simple to think about, and that is that every single one of us has that uniqueness of DNA and situation and context. We know that when we think about it, or you recognize it when I say it to you. What that means is that we are the world's expert on us.
Agreed.
Yeah? And what we sort of hope, and it is a hope and an expectation, is that other people will be bothered to find out about us because they're curious people. That is not the case. When you're in the recruitment world and trying to find work, people are interested to a degree, but not that interested. So the if you like, the imposition is on us personally to take this really, really seriously and work out what it is that we've got that we believe is quite valuable out there in the market. Because when we get into our conversation a bit downstream, we're going to be talking about uniqueness of the proposition that we bring. And unless we've done that diagnostic work, we don't know. The other thing that's happened is whether you are 20, 40, 60, it doesn't really matter where you are in your life. The things that really have lit you up in your life have been forgotten until you go and do the work that you and I are suggesting that people do at this stage. So what was it that what triggered me into having an interest in dancing or in sport or whatever it was? And it goes way, way back to something that could be part of our DNA and our genetics from the family we're in, or possibly because somebody, some teacher, really ignited our interest in a particular subject at school. Unless we agree with ourselves, we contract with ourselves to do this sort of work, we're never going to get underneath the things that are likely to be really important when we go into the job market. That's really where I'm.
So how would you approach a sort of the process of doing some diagnostics? Because for me, it looks like asking questions such as, what do you enjoy in your current job? And I think you've got to link it back to two things: values and skills that you like to use. Because I know from my own personal experience that, I know this sounds a bit boastful, but I'm going to say it anyway, that I'm good at quite a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I enjoy doing all of that stuff. And people often ask me, why did you give up journalism? And the answer was pretty straightforward for me. I'm good at writing, but I didn't particularly like the type of writing I was doing because I wasn't mad about, writing about law firms for the rest of my life, about which, partner hires, office closures, etc. So for me, I really realized that I like the content, the careers related stuff, but not necessarily the, writing a 2,500 word feature about law firm strategies. So I quickly worked out what aspects of my job I like doing, and what I didn't want to be doing going forward. And I also, the other part for me was looking around to the environment I was in, career progression, had I plateaued, etc. So I think it can take multiple angles, but it does require you to actually sit down and think about it. And I think some people just gloss it over. What do you think?
No, I think they do. And I think just in the last couple of minutes, you've given a really good example of just how complex this whole arena is when you talk about values and skills and environment, just picking those three things. Each of those subjects on their own are huge. I'll just give you one idea, one tip that I know has worked really well for some people. This sort of thing doesn't always work well for everybody. I'm going to give you something which is quite analytical, quite spreadsheety in the way I've described it, but you could convert it into a picture if you're more creative and more visual. But to take your point about the sort of work that you've done, you can start with the moment you left education and you started your career, and you don't need to have a job spec on every single job that you've ever done. You just need the headline things that you did. There are probably 3 or 4 or 5 bullet points. This is what I did. Then in the next 2 columns, you can actually put down how good you thought you were at them. And then in the final column, how much you enjoyed it. And use a color scheme. Use red for rubbish and green for brilliant, whatever you want, or a 1 to 5 scale. And then when you've done that, just look at where you've got, this is what I was doing and I was really good at it. And I really, really enjoyed it. Because if you can build whatever comes next in this process of reinventing ourselves and following your heart, as it were, if you are working on that base, then you're in really good shape. And what I find, I've just in the middle of working with somebody who's in their early 50s, and every single environment they've been in has been toxic. And they have, because of who they are, felt they needed to stay there 2, 3, 4 years in order to prove it to whom? Is life a rehearsal? No. As you say in the headlines to this invitation today, we want to find things which we really love in the work that we do. We spend enough time at it. Wouldn't it be nice?
And I think this point about skills is so important, because when I'm talking to clients or contacts about changing careers, people are drawn quite quickly, and I think this is quite unique, or certainly more prevalent in the legal sector, is this notion that you have to go for big brands. And what they're doing is they're attracted to either employers or potential job titles. Oh, I want to work in marketing. I want to reinvent myself and become a journalist. But they don't realize that there are certain aspects of those jobs that carry, that overlap with the day-to-day skills you'll be using in your current job, which is great from a transferable skills point of view. But I think that a far more sort of appropriate way of looking at all of this is, what do you actually like doing on a day-to-day basis, rather than I want to go and work for GlaxoSmithKline and find the cure for COVID. That sounds great. The headline sounds amazing, but if that involves you sitting in a lab and having no human contact, but you crave working with other people, then it's a complete mismatch.
Exactly, and this is another layer of complexity in the whole thing, because if you had a desire to go and do what you said in a pharmaceutical company, why choose that one? And actually, I don't know many pharmaceutical companies that do any R&D now. It's completely outsourced. So you're likely to go to smaller type of biotech environments, in which case you have to do quite a lot of research to understand what that market is that you can take yourself. And this is, to me, in career terms, the absolute crux of what we're talking about. On the one hand, as we were saying a moment ago, we're trying to understand who we are so that we can create a value. We can see our value and take a value proposition to market. And on the other hand, we're clear about what it is out there and who it is who's going to value what it is that we've got. And just spreading CVs around and behaving in a knee-jerk reaction sort of a way is not the way to do it. Not if you're serious about reinventing yourself and as we say, finding the job that you love. So I suppose the conclusion there, one summary, is that if you really want to find what you love, you've got to work at it. It's not something that's just going to suddenly appear like some magic, tree.
It's funny you should say that, because the number of people who speak to me about changing career direction, reinvention, they often reach out to me in the hope that I can just give them the answer on a plate. And it's something that's got to come from within. I don't think, as you said, you are the expert of yourself. No one else will tell you whether you're good, you're going to enjoy a particular environment, etc. I don't want to get bogged down on skills, because we're going to come back onto that, because in connection with the sort of transferable skills point, which is sort of further down the sort of pecking order in terms of the planning and the how you approach a change in career. What I'd like to talk about self-limiting beliefs, because I think one of the biggest obstacles about pursuing this change of direction is that little voice in your head telling you you're too old, you're too young, you're not relevant, you can't do this, you can't afford to do it, people will think you're a failure, etc. What are your tips on how you can navigate your way around, what I call the self-limiting beliefs versus the real live sort of barriers that people need to overcome?
Well, I happen to be, and probably you too, from the school that says there are no barriers. So I'm thinking about probably the oldest person that I've worked with was 69, and he was about to have to stop doing what he did because the parliamentary legislation in Britain said you cannot be a judge after the age of 70, right? He's still employed. He's doing all sorts of things in support of his legal work, but in areas where he had an interest, but he had never thought of it as something that would keep him busy because he was too busy judging, right? So, I mean, that's just one example, but I don't believe there are any. And I know you and I posed the question on the website about, is it too early or too late to switch? I don't believe it is. I think if you're really, really interested in it, and if you have that real desire to go and do something, it is never too late. You may face some economic imperatives around, can I afford to take a break at this time and invest in myself to go and do a degree because I want to be a nurse, and I'm, and will they employ me when I have? But there's nothing in the law now that can stop us from working in whatever our occupations are, with some limitations. You can't be a fire officer or an airline pilot after a certain age for good medical reasons, but really the opportunity is boundless and boundaryless as well. So I would encourage people to not worry too much about being bound. The biggest, and you've probably seen this, Husnara, as well, one of the biggest areas of obstacles is in the minds of the families that you grew up with, who said, oh no, you can't do that. Oh no, I've never seen you doing that. All of that sort of negative stuff, rather than talking to people who see you and your value, use that word again, in a different way. No, I can genuinely see that you could do that. And so, thinking positively, but also finding people who reinforce that positivism, that sense of opportunity, I think is quite important for us.
That's a really good point, because I think if you surround yourself by people who, I think someone compared them to a radiator pipe, that they drain you of all your energy and enthusiasm, then
good
you're going to really struggle to move forward. That said, I think that, self-limiting beliefs is a big issue for people. And I think the way I've helped others tackle this point is to almost write a list of everything that they, every reason they can come up with as to why they can't achieve the goal they've set themselves. And then to put them, going back to your Excel spreadsheet point, coming up with, putting them into two columns. One is, is this the voice in my head? What evidence do I have that this isn't possible or this is possible? And then I do think that there are some real barriers that do exist. Some of them could be to do with timing. The idea being that if you do need to go and do a complete start from the beginning, and you need to retrain because you need to do a vocational course that's compulsory for you to get into a certain profession, there may be potential timing issues as to when you can enroll on those courses. For some people, money could be a concern, but that one is obviously very subjective. And as far as I'm concerned, budget. Don't make sweeping generalizations such as I can't afford to do it. In the same way that, I think so many people I speak to, when talking about the affordability point because some retraining may require a cut in salary. I know when I quit law to become a journalist, my salary went down by 2/3. Okay, it was significant. It was life-changing, which meant that I had to rent my flat, move back with my parents, etc. But I found a way around it simply by doing some planning, rather than allowing myself to talk myself out of it by saying, no, I can't afford to do it. Similarly, I think it's also worth remembering when looking at salaries, which is a way people often decide whether or not something is doable or achievable or realistic, is don't just look at what a starting salary would be if you were to go back to the beginnings of your journey. I think it's really important to also look at earning potential, because there are, because a lot of people think, no, I can't possibly take a £30,000 pay cut, without looking to see how quickly they could go up the sort of salary rankings, I guess.
Yes.
What do you think, Simon?
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with that. And I can think of people who have done, taken a similar step as you just talked about in different professions. And of course, there is a trade-off, because the economics around this are but one part. If you're being highly paid and you're highly stressed and you're really not enjoying it, and it's actually doing your health a lot of harm, why wouldn't you reset and maybe earn less but feel better? And one of my brothers had been a journalist actually for about 30 years before going into teaching. He'd always really wanted to teach English, and now he is, and he's in his mid-50s. So yeah, he's happy.
Yeah, no, I think that I don't want to dwell on self-limiting beliefs, because I think the main message I want everyone to take away from this is that it is really important to determine whether these are genuine obstacles or just ideas that are floating around your head. Okay, and with the sort of genuine obstacles, there's usually a way around it. And with regard to the point you made about ignoring, or at least not taking it too seriously when people say you can't possibly do that, or you can't afford to do it, people would think you're silly. So I think that it's really important not to be overly to not be overly influenced, I think, by other people's opinions, because it really is just their opinion. Because ultimately, if people genuinely care about you, then I'd like to think they'd support you through the transition.
I agree, and just to reiterate, my experience is that people who are quite close to you, particularly your family, can give you quite a warped sense of what they think you might be doing in your career.
Yeah.
And they don't. I think the best that we can do as parents and loved ones within family settings is to provide the support and the space for people to work this out for themselves, not ladle on our own stuff.
Have you got any advice on how you can actually give people the confidence to take the jump? Or do you think that comes later through having gone through the processes we're describing?
Well, it does. Yeah. Sorry, finish your sentence.
No, I was just going to say, because a lot of people feel that it's really, you need to be quite brave and bold to do this. Yes. And that's what is ultimately holding them back, not having the confidence.
Well, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a young woman who I'd known since she was about 5. And she asked us if she could come and have a chat with me over a cup of tea when she was about 18. And she was at the point where she was going to leave school and go to college. And she came, I said, so what's up? And she said, I'm really struggling with the fact that my mum thinks I should be a barrister. So I said, and what's your view? And she said, I don't want to. I never have wanted to follow that particular path. I said, well, why does your mum think that you want to be a barrister? And it was because she dressed up in a gown and a mortarboard when she was 5 at a party or something. It goes way, way back to something. This is what had been carried and discussed around the supper table in their home. She was the middle of 3 girls, quite regularly, until she got to a stage where, no, I'm going to go to university. And in fact, in her case, she went off and did psychology. What was interesting about her, though, was that she was about as far away from someone in a profession as you could get, because she was really entrepreneurial. And I found that out a little bit later. And now she's an entrepreneur. She's doing fantastic work globally as well, funded by all sorts of private equity companies. So, it's so easy for us to get it wrong. And I think to your earlier question, really, the important thing is to be true to yourself and what it is that you think and feel is the right thing for you.
Okay. Now, the other psychological part of reinvention or switching careers, I think, well, certainly from conversations I've had with people who want to do this, is either the brain just playing, where you reach a block and you think, I know I want to change, but I'm not sure what I can be doing. So that lack of ideas as to what, because especially I know, again, sorry, I know I keep referring to lawyers, but that's sort of my background. But and lawyers are probably quite an extreme example, because lawyers tend to hang out with other lawyers, and the only profession they know, and frankly that they deem sort of worthy of knowing, are other lawyers. So often they don't know what else they could be doing. And then you've got the polar opposite, which is lawyers or other professionals I've spoken to saying to me, Husnara, I've got so many ideas swirling around my head. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. And I really don't know how to actually narrow this down, because I just feel as though I'm spinning lots of plates in the air and nothing is sticking. A bit like your mudslinging exercise, just applying for everything. And they're probably also applying for stuff at the same time and wondering why it's not working. So any tips on how you can sort of make the mud stick, I guess?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the person that is clear about what it is that they want to do is the one that's going to have the most success in taking themselves to a market and finding work, whether they create their own business or whether they go and work with colleagues or whether they go and find a job on someone's payroll. But the clarity is the most important thing. So if we just go back to your question, how do we get from this point of too many ideas overwhelming us to the point where we're really clear? And I think there are a number of stages to it, and we've already talked about one, which is how much of a diagnostic do we do? Because sitting in there it's a process of unearthing all sorts of facets of ourselves. You've touched on skills and values and environment, and we talked about the CV and all there are so many different parts to it. And when you actually really understand that, it's almost like an evaluation process on yourself of what it is that you've got. The next thing to do is to say, what could I do with that? And not, to your point, not be in any way suffocating yourself with your own belief system. Let it just go. And can you do that on your own? Probably not. You might need somebody with you, a career coach, yes, or maybe somebody that knows you well enough to open it all up. And why do I say that? Because you don't want, when you get a bit further on, you don't want to feel that you've missed anything. So if it included, I wanted to be Superman and it will go to the moon, put it down, everything down, and you'll end up with 30, 40, 50, 60 plus options here. Then when you can see them all, there are going to be some we just say, nah, that's left field. That didn't really mean that. And you get down to a smaller number. Then you have to apply some criteria. This gets back to your house hunting analogy. What are the things that I really have to think about? How much do I need to earn? Well, earnings are not quite as we think, actually. It's not just about how much salary. It's also about bonus. It could be about equity. It could be about other things like, dental insurance and stuff. So each of these has got a sort of a load of detail beneath it. But the big ones are money, family, and geography. So
I'm glad you said geography. Sorry to interrupt you, because that one people just neglect and don't.
Yeah, well, and there are other things, because there are other things which could be soft, like geography is I want to live in Surrey and I don't want to live in Hertfordshire. That's a geographic decision. But there are other things which are they're more intangible, but they are based on things you've already said about the type of team I might want to be involved in and those sorts of things, sort of more work environment stuff. But put them down and then score them against your options, and what happens? You squeeze the options until you get down to probably, in my experience, 2, 3 or 4 options, and then you've got a bit of wrestling to do. But now you haven't got 50 or 40, you're down to a much, much smaller number. And that having gone through this process, it's really there's a direct link back to me and that diagnostic work that I did on myself. And that's why it's so powerful, because if you stay open too long, you frustrate yourself to the point of anxiety and stress, because it's the mud against the wall thing. You're not quite sure where you're going with this. And And, when we get a bit further on with this, it's very difficult to be authentic when you're talking to somebody that you might want to partner with or work for, if you've got too many things rattling around in your head.
Yep. Now, I've done that exercise actually, where firstly I started off by looking at values, and then I did a massive brainstorm with family, friends, etc., on everything that I could be doing. And the list was hilarious because it included everything from working as a makeup counter girl in my local department store through to writing a food blog, etc. Because what I did was generated ideas based on hobbies, interests, values, past hobbies, future goals, etc. I just threw everything into the mix. And then what I did was, I ended up with, as you say, a list of ideas that was so long that it would have just made me faint if I tried to find a job at any of those things. And it was easy enough to quickly eliminate stuff because I realized that it was just a bit sort of airy-fairy. But what helped me to really create a more manageable shortlist was, as you say, to have that important criteria. And for me, it was, interestingly, I needed to earn a certain amount of money. Geography played a part. I wanted a job that involved a reasonable commute. And then the third one for me was I wanted to do something that involved people, because that was the main thing that kept screaming out at me when I sort of did all the values type exercises. Before we move on to sort of the next stage of the process, I just saw a question pop up, which is very pertinent, about the current economic climate and whether now is actually the right time to do this, bearing in mind that you're potentially going to be going head to head with people who have the right skill set.
And the implication of the question is that somebody's employed now.
Possibly, yeah. I can see in that if you in a tight jobs market, which we're inevitably having to sort of deal with at the moment, is that people are, you could be applying against someone who's already been doing the job in a different organization who has perhaps been made redundant. Whereas I've, wandered along, having a great career doing something else, now trying to convince an employer you should do that.
Yes. Well, it might be a great time and it might not be a great time, but if you've got the sort of safe harbor of work, you can test it and do the work we're talking about this afternoon, but on yourself, and but you can go and test it. And if you think that actually it's too risky, because for the reasons you've just mentioned, that there could be people out there who can eat you for breakfast, then it probably isn't. I would say though, when I think of people that I know and their how well they're going, they could be very happy and doing fine, but the really key objective criterion that I use is the business that they're in or organization that they're in growing in terms of the demand for it in the market or not. So not would be retail or aviation, yeah, but probably pharmacological research could be on the other side of it, right? So that's one of the key things when you're thinking about this, particularly behind this question, is what is the risk if I'm going out and wanting to do something in an industry, a sector, a segment of a sector that is actually on the slide. I've got to be, really, really think, how much do I want to do that? And I've got to probably do it in a different way because I've carry on this way. So give you an example, stick with retail. I wouldn't want to go and work for one of the big brands that is mainly, in properties on the high street, but I might in terms of e-commerce businesses, which have been absolutely raring away this year, through the pandemic, and will continue to, because the business model is changing. So, I think strategically, that's what you have to do, is to have a really good look at just what's happening with the labour market relative to what it is you're thinking of moving into.
And that's part of the reality checking, isn't it? Because we haven't really touched properly on reality checking. We've talked about it in the context of physical barriers to making a change. I think ultimately it depends on your personal circumstances, because if you have been made redundant from a job that is in, from a sector that's in decline, then you may find that there's a forced element to this reinvention. Okay.
I agree.
Yeah. So it depends on whether you're currently in a job or not. And you may find that the only way of getting a job is to be a bit more open-minded about things that you could be applying to and doing. And I find that quite a lot of people end up switching directions simply because they followed trends, etc. And I think that has to be part of your thinking process. What are the trends? What are the sectors that are growing? As well as, going back to the point we raised regarding skills. Also, I think that, I know we're jumping ahead now and looking at sort of job search techniques, but in this climate where employers are a bit more cautious, I think we'll see more sort of fixed term contracts, consultancy type works, which I think could be a way in, because a lot of people, again, not only do they want me to tell them what job they should switch to, they also expect me to give them a magic bullet, which will just give them the new job on a plate. And sometimes that journey can take a while, and it might involve taking a couple of bridging jobs to take you closer to the end goal. Similarly, you may find that, the processes we've talked about can be quite slow. So for people thinking about career changes from today onwards, may find that by the time they get to the point of looking for jobs, I hope the economy picks up, because people expect it to be quite an instant process, and I don't think it is. What do you think?
I agree with you. And one thing that you did say, which I think is quite related to the question that was just asked, strategically, we are going to see quite a shift away from the contracting of permanent employees, full or part-time, to a more mobile and flexible workforce. Every single employer I've touched in the last 4 months hasn't just said, look, we're going to have some sort of reshape, which is going to mean that some people will lose their jobs. But every single one of them have made a comment about effectiveness through the pandemic, using more flexibility of hours and labor and remote workers and so on. So, and many people, millions, have actually got used to something they never had any experience of before March as well.
Yep.
So I think in addition to what you've said, it's about what people will feel more comfortable than they may have done before to go and work more in the gig economy. Right, so that means that I'm bringing my skills to play here, and that's what I'm earning from. But I'm no longer working full time for them. I'm doing a bit for, etc. So I think that's part of the strategic change we will see. It's a natural thing in our markets to see these sorts of things, but they're just going to be accelerated. So I think we're going to see a higher level, in sheer number terms, a higher level of unemployment than we've ever seen in this country, partly because our population's grown and our working population's grown. But I think we'll see that adjustment that we're just alluding to now.
Agreed. Okay, so we've spoken about the ideas generation, making your sort of list of areas that you're going to investigate or explore further a bit more manageable. So now let's assume that we've got down to a short list of about 3 ideas, which I think sounds quite reasonable. What next?
Well, the most optimal route from my perspective is not to have 3, but 1. And the reason I say that is that if you go for more than one thing and you think you feel comfortable because you've got two irons in the fire, you'll get found out by good people.
Can I just interrupt just to clarify what I meant? I was thinking in terms of ideas to research further. I agree with you. If you try to pursue 3 different routes simultaneously, it could dilute your efforts. But what I meant was, taking that list down from 50 to about 3 to do a bit more research, because for me, that research point is really important as well.
Yeah. So yes, I've just scooted ahead a bit. You have to do the research in all 3 in order to get to 1.
Yes.
Yeah? And people sometimes think, well, I've got 3, that's fine. They'll get found out. And, women are 5 times as intuitive as men. They'll find out, when they ask you, so what else have you got going on? And if you think you can get away with lying, you will not, right? So there's something about being authentic, but you're right. You have to do that research and really understand, because you don't want to jettison your third and second option in pursuit of your first option until you know. And the only way you're going to know is by doing the research, as you say.
Yeah, and the technical phrase for that, by the way, is informational interviews. I send lots of people onto these, go off to have these discussions with people who they already know that might be able to give you a bit of an insight into certain sort of career options and paths that you might want to follow. Because I think one of the reasons why people are unsuccessful in making the switch is that they don't really know what they're applying for. And
Yes.
the matching process then becomes a bit skewed.
Yeah. And I agree with you. There are lots of different ways of doing your research, but actually talking to people who can give you the inside line on what I actually do and how I do it and who with, and what is this tribe that I'm a part of, and what sort of backgrounds do we have from from a qualitative or qualification perspective. I'm working with a guy at the moment who's really interested in the cyber space environment, but he hasn't got a background in cyber security, although he's doing some stuff, he's learning, but he's got to bring an operational management background into the cybersecurity world. Absolutely no doubt that he'll make it, because cybersecurity is growing. It's one of those sectors or segments that is. But yeah, you're right. It has to be, you really have to open yourself up to quite a bit of hard work around really understanding what you're going to go in for. Because otherwise, I mean, the worst that can happen is that you do all this work and make this commitment and then find you don't like it. And you go, oh my God, now what?
Yeah, because I think that with the exception of maybe a handful of jobs, most jobs still remain a mystery to me. When someone tells me that they do X for a living, I have no idea what that actually means in terms of day-to-day responsibilities. So, and going back to what I said about people coming up with ideas that relate to either an industry or a particular organization or a job title, but they don't realize that most jobs tend to involve similar day-to-day tasks.
They do, but my experience is that, and it may be different in the legal profession and the medical profession, but most people that I've met in the places that I've worked, you'll find people who are ostensibly doing the same thing. That's what they're paid to do and their job title says, but none of them are. They're doing what we've talked about earlier, which is they're playing to their particular strengths. And if they're well led, what I've just said is being encouraged by the leader to allow people to play in their best space, because that's where they're most productive and effective. So it's quite a complex element of the world of work, is to sort of find yourself. You have to go through the various processes we're talking about, and the application to selection to be accepted process to get in, and you have to show you've got the credentials to do that and the experience and skills and so on. Once you're there, what you actually do day to day will grow with you within your organization. That's just a fact of life.
All right, Simon, I'm conscious of time, so we've spoken quite a lot about the theory of doing this. Let's make it happen. How do you go about switching careers when it comes to the job search side of it? So let's assume that you've got someone who has decided they want to do it. They've now got an idea. I found the process relatively easy. Because the thinking part for me was quite quick, because I knew from an early stage of my career that I wanted to make the switch from law to journalism, and but I knew that there was a skills deficit, that I needed to convince employers that I had a genuine interest in journalism. So I did a mini journalism course. A lot of journalists do end up doing a master's, but I decided that, again, practically from my perspective, I couldn't not afford to earn for a year. And I'm not the most academic type. So for me, doing a summer school in journalism was sufficient. And then what I did really was play to my strengths. One of my tutors on my journalism course made the most helpful suggestion, which is, why don't you approach the legal titles about becoming a journalist with them? You've got the industry knowledge. You're a former lawyer. I bet you'll get snapped up. And that's pretty much what happened. So what I did was stuck to an industry that I knew, but did a different job in the industry. So that's one way around it, I think, because I knew that the editor on the Lawyer magazine where I ended up working would give credence to my legal CV. And I find that a lot of people who reinvent themselves tend to stick to the sector because it's a slightly easier transition, I think. What are your thoughts, Simon?
Well, I think in what you've just said is a classic case study of what one should do. When you've decided, you've gone through what we were saying earlier on, you've decided on the thing that you want to pursue, there is likely to be, if you're trying to change tack a bit, there's going to be a skills and experience deficit. You know, that gap that you invested in by doing that many journalistic course is an example of that. And who knows, you know, what that will be, because it'll be very, very different for every individual in their own situation. But there's going to be. So how much of it you can actually cover yourself is one thing, but it's the intent that you are, because that shows the commitment to anybody that might be interested in you and in hiring you. Then the next thing you said was that there was somebody who was your lecturer, tutor on your course who you know, was a key contact for you, who was willing to give you some advice on where to go, and it was sounded like really, really good advice. So part of this, what you called earlier on informational interviews, in my experience, that what they do is also they open up new contacts, new groups of people that you never knew before, but are actually going to prove to be quite useful for you now, because your, you know, your existing or your old contact space, lovely people as they are not going to necessarily going to be useful for you tomorrow. So you need a new network, and understanding that. And then based on the advice of your lecturer and what you then went and did, was they were saying you have a value that is, in their view, unique. Well, all the work that we've been talking about over the last 45 minutes is about understanding what that value is. And then you go and talk to somebody who needs it. And that then hits what I said earlier on, that almost like chemical or biochemical fusion of the value you have with the value that they need. And that, again, is part of this whole piece around understanding that market, doing your research well, getting the right sort of contacts, connections, and conversations with people, so that you are positioning yourself the best that you can. Whether you're going to come out of this as a consultant or as a whatever may be, you know, an advisor or an employee, that's secondary to actually getting yourself into that place. And it feels like it's warm, if not hot, you know, when you get there, because you know you're completely in the right place.
Yeah, because the two things that I think worked heavily in my favor was the fact that I stuck with a sector that I was familiar with. And I think lots of people do that. And that's, I think, you know, an easier sort of sell when trying to convince employers to take you more seriously. The other thing that I did, which I, you know, is one of my pet topics, is tapped into my network. And I did not go anywhere near a recruiter. I applied for 3 jobs speculatively, but, you know, used my network to identify who I needed to speak to. And then when I made the switch from journalism to recruitment, it really was about my network. I mean, frankly, and that's how a lot of people are quite skeptical about how that can work. And recently I've been talking to quite a lot of people about networking and using the phrase leaving a trail of breadcrumbs and comparing networking to business development. So as you do those informational interviews, I think that it's really important to keep the sort of dialogue ongoing and asking people to introduce you to others. So who else could I be speaking to, so that you're building your network. And then because networking in the context of job search techniques or in the context of business development, they're both quite slow burners. So I think it is really important that any work you do now will hopefully bear fruit once you get to the point where you're in a position to actually start applying for jobs. So anyone who's thinking about changing careers, I think, needs to sort of get out there and meet people sooner rather than later.
I agree. Where you said at the beginning of your piece there about your knowledge of a sector, it's also true if you have a set of skills, because the skills can be transferable, you know, particularly if they're bucketed up. You don't necessarily use the same skills in the same place all the time. So my experience, I had a 24-year career with 6 organizations, 4 for sure, maybe 5 of which everybody that you meet in business would know. You know, they were big. I applied for 1 job in my life. I've been working 40 years this year. I've only ever applied for 1 job. And it was because for the same reasons. Actually, it was for the same impact, but the reasons were different. I was looking for businesses doing interesting things that were complicated. And that's what I was bringing, in terms of skill set, was the ability to deal with the individual in complex places, complex enough for me not to know what's going on either. And to be able to use my curiosity and my intellect, I suppose, to make it simple enough to know what to do. Yeah. And then what to lead. So that was my story. But I applied for a job in 1985 with Shell. And I got the job because they hadn't been able to find anyone. They'd gone through 2 rounds of interviews and hadn't found anybody. And then I ended up there. So that, and you're right, the power of your network and how you play that, and you're right about the slow burn. It's not something that you're going to meet somebody and suddenly they're just going to go poof like that. It doesn't work like that. It can take a long time. But if you do it well, they'll never forget you. And they'll contact you.
So other than networking and potential retraining to fill that gap in your CV, to get you closer to where you want to be, what other tips do you have for the looking for a job part of the process?
I would just build on your point about you never use a recruiter, and I would say approach this as if the recruitment industry didn't exist, because then it would force you to do some of the things that we've just been talking about. Of course, you will want to use the recruitment industry, but you need to do so in a really smart way. In my experience, the best recruiters really know their markets, and the best have been, situated in one place in the market, whether that's law or private equities or whatever it may be, for a very long time. So they're a bit like bank analysts. They really do understand, the whole lie of the land, and the future decisions that are being made, as well as the players. So they can be really useful. They can be useful from an informational interview perspective, and certainly as a network. But I think it's down to the skills that you were alluding to earlier on, and how you use them. And please don't go firing off your CV. In my storybook, my playbook, if you like, the CV is used when somebody has accepted a job and then they want to know more about you, and you just say, well, put that on your file if you need it. Yeah, it's not something you want to use. Of course you need to build one, and of course then the reality is that you're going to use it, but be very careful how you use it. Use it like your passport. Yeah, use it when you need to go through that barrier and they need to know who you are, rather than every time you spray it around the market, you dilute yourself. Yeah. So that's another key message.
Unless, of course, it's someone, because I work with very junior lawyers, and some of them have switched at quite a junior stage. But what they've done is they've gone almost at graduate level because they feel that they haven't progressed enough in their current job to not warrant going back to the start. And it's sometimes, in some industries, that's the harsh reality. It's the only way you're going to get in, because they can be a bit more rigid about how you sort of break in. And you can, in that situation, the employer has actually asked for an application form. And interestingly enough, application forms that are competency-based are a bit of a gift to career changers, because it's very much there, and goes back to the point that we raised right from the outset. It's about the skills. And I think most people listening to this recording will be highly skilled, and I'm really confident that they will be able to pull together a list of examples to showcase those competencies the employer is after.
And I think what you just said is absolutely spot on, and I don't think it goes away from a major theme of our conversation today, has been the volumetric compared to the very specific. Yeah. So if you are in a specific place doing a competency application for something, and you've got, as you say, the chances are that you're going to really shine through if you've got the right sort of background. That's great. But I really just think it's a sort of a health warning. Don't play the volumetric game, because I think particularly with a rising tide of unemployment and structural change in the economy, that's going to mean a lot of anxiety for you if that's the game you play.
No, agreed. We're going to run out of time very soon, so I just wanted to ask the audience if there are any more questions. We'll give them a moment to type anything. While we wait for that, are there any last thoughts that you had, Simon?
Well, I was just thinking that. I think the last thought I would have is take this process seriously. You know, when you finish when it's the end of your days, you look at the proportion of your life that you will have spent working. You want to have taken it seriously and have given yourself the best chance to do what you wanted to do. But as you said earlier on, Husnara, this is not something that somebody's going to give you. You know, it's something that you have to work at, and you have to put yourself into the right places to achieve.
Yeah, okay, no more questions from the audience. So in terms of my closing remarks, I agree with you in that ultimately you reap what you sow. This is a slow process for some people. It requires a lot of thinking and, you know, time that's invested in the way, but it's nice because I think that it can be quite a fun process as well, because you learn lots of things about yourself. And the research side of things is really fascinating, because you might find out about jobs and industries that you didn't even know existed, and probably didn't exist when you were applying for university.
Yeah.
Because lots of jobs are coming up now that, you know, relating to social media, for example, that just weren't around. And I suspect there'll be jobs people are doing now that won't be around in the future. So I think be open to the idea of change. Be brave. No, I'm sorry. I did get asked a question, by the way.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't. It says, any tips for 18-year-olds just starting out who are far less certain of their skill set and values in a difficult jobs market?
Just starting out.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say normally, and this may not apply here, but stay under the cover of education for as long as you can. That's always the case. When for my kids, I said, you know, if you don't know what you want to do, don't get going until you're ready, or you complete your education. So stay if you can. If you're choosing not to do that, then a lot of the things that we have said need to apply. I would say to somebody at 18, if you're not going to go on to college or higher education, look at an apprenticeship in a field that suits you, because again, you're actually still learning and you're actually deepening a skill set that will probably last you for a long time, despite what you said. I mean, there will be half-life of skills that need to be changed in mid-career, but somebody doing an apprenticeship may well do things which will last for the next 40 odd years. So yeah, and I think as far as going, if you didn't do that as an 18-year-old, please avoid the things that we were saying that had a health warning on. Don't just put a CV and throw it out there and just sort of land somewhere. Not unless that is your intent, that you just don't care what you do work-wise, you just want to be working and earn some money. But I would say, good luck with that, because it feels like, you know, you're sort of setting off without a chart, you know, a sailing vessel leaving.
Yeah, and my take on that is, firstly, you know, given the fact that I'm living proof, and in fact you as well, Simon, that you can change as you go along and adapt and explore different things. So I don't think the decision you make as an 18-year-old is going to necessarily impact the rest of your life in the way that people think. You know, you will probably have more than one career. Second, if you can stay in education, fine, but don't feel that university is the only way forward. Apprenticeships, I think, still add a lot of value. And in certain vocations, I think the apprenticeship route, frankly, is preferable anyway. And if you do go down a degree route, then plenty of people do degrees that are completely unrelated to the job they get at the end. So I think have some flexibility built in. There are lots of reasons to stay optimistic. And I'm a known pessimist, but I'd like to think that by the time anyone who's currently at university graduates, the market will have picked up again. It'll look different. I agree that there'll be some, you know, permanent structural changes to the way the market looks and what jobs exist. So I think be alive to the fact that it is evolving as well.
Yeah. Well
Brilliant.
said.
I think we're going to be out of time. I think that's a nice place to end it. So thank you very much, firstly, to the audience for listening. And thank you to you, Simon. It's been really fascinating talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.